and dealing in more detail with texts about women's role in the assembly, and I'd mostly worked up a sermon back then on it on the computer, and then I've never gotten around to getting back to that, but I'm going to be doing that this evening. But there's so much detail in all of that I'm going to use this morning to cover some of the basics of the texts so that we won't have to cover everything this evening. And the two texts that we're going to be talking about and contrasting this morning, because they're very similar in concept, but they're also a bit different in detail, are 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, and 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34 and 35. Here's the text in 1 Timothy 2. Starting here in verse 11, let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection. But I permit not a woman to teach, nor to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. Let's read that again and see what it's saying. There's both a positive and a negative instruction here. I let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection. That's what she's instructed to do, to be in quietness with all subjection. In contrast, in verse 12, I permit not a woman to teach, nor to have dominion over a man, and then coming back to, but to be in quietness. Then the reasons are given in verse 13 and 14. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, God's original order of creation. And Adam was not beguiled, but the woman being beguiled hath fallen into transgression. Going back to Genesis chapter 3, when the curses were placed, and certain curses were placed on Eve, certain curses were placed on Adam. On Adam, there was that he would have to fight the thorns and the thistles, etc. On Eve, one of the things was about her desire being to her husband. Pardon me. But summing up again what we have in this text, we have learning in quietness, in subjection, not teaching or having dominion over, but being in quietness. Now here's the passage in 1 Corinthians 14, which is very similar, but also a bit different. After discussing the roles of the prophets and tongue speakers and such, it says, starting in the middle of verse 33, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, as to whether or not this phrase should go with verse 33 as in some Bibles, or whether it should go with verse 34 as in other Bibles. This is from the American Standard, and it places this with verse 34. As in all the churches of the saints, let the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but let them also be in subjection, as also saith the law. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. And then it's followed with a rebuke of, what? Was it from you that the word of God went forth? Or came it to you alone? If any man thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him take knowledge that the things which I write unto you, they are the commandment of the Lord. Now clearly we can see some very striking similarities in these texts. We have the reference to subjection. Let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection. Here it is, let a woman keep silence in the church. It's not permitted unto them to speak, but let them be in subjection. This one says, as also saith the law. And this apparently is referring back to not the law of Moses, but in the sense of that the first 5 books of the Old Testament were often referred to as the books of the law. Genesis 3, where this order was put in place in respect to the man and woman. As also saith the law. Here you have specified what the law said. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not beguiled, but the woman being beguiled hath fallen into transgression. Here the word is, let them keep silence. In the King James, it uses silence in both texts, This is really a little bit better in this instance because it renders this one quietness and this one silence. And these are two different Greek words, and we're going to look at that in a moment. And we're going to see that this word is less emphatic and this word is more emphatic. They can mean the same thing, but they kind of match up to our English word silence and quiet. Silence in English pretty much means what? Silence. Quiet in English, sometimes it means silent, and sometimes it doesn't, right? For instance, sometimes you refer to a person as being a quiet person. Well, you wouldn't use the word silent there. Well, he's kind of a silent person. And so lots of times we have this with words where there's a common area where they mean the same thing, but there's also other areas over here. Let's take like boat and canoe and ship. You know, there's a certain area that they all cover, and then there's certain, a ship would never be a canoe, and canoe would never be a ship, but boat can refer to a gunboat, you know, a good-sized boat. It can refer to a little bitty lifeboat and various things. We're going to talk about range in a minute, but just to let you know what we'll see in a minute, quietness can go from silence all the way to speaking, but not silent, as we'll see. This word is not so. This is a word that's more emphatic in its meaning. It means silence. Some other details. This one specifies specifically the scope and setting it's talking about. In the churches. This one does not. It might be presumed, it might be assumed, but it doesn't come out and say it as this one did. In general, what we're going to see is that between the two texts, 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, although they both deal with the woman needing to be in subjection because of what the law said, and either not speaking or not teaching or being in quietness or being silent, we'll find that 1 Corinthians 14 is more specific and worded a little bit more emphatic, whereas 1 Timothy 2 is worded in what could be taken, theoretically anyway at least, as being in a more general way. As to location, does Timothy specify in detail the setting that he's talking about? Paul writing to Timothy. No. In setting, does 1 Corinthians 14 specify in the churches? Yes. In the degree of speaking, of silence or whatever, 1 Timothy 2 says don't teach and be quiet. 1 Corinthians 14 says not only don't teach, but don't speak, not even to ask a question, and be silent. So it's a little more specific and more emphatic. Let's take a look at these two words now and see how they work. We'll start with this one since we've got it there. The word silence here is sigao. It's not a good S. And let me read to you from Art and Gingrich what that word means. Sigao, first meaning is say nothing, keep silent. B, the second meaning is stop speaking, become silent. And then a second meaning below those two under the first is to keep secret or conceal. Now, let's take a look at some places where this word is used in the New Testament. First one is in Mark chapter 14, verse 61. Mark chapter 14, verse 61. Oh, by the way, let me explain this, especially for those of you that are visiting. This passage right here is similar to a few other passages that are interpreted in a number of different ways by different people. And that's one of the reasons we're taking the time to go through what the different words mean and everything. There's several passages like that in the Bible that if you look at various commentators or listen to different people or people with different beliefs, you'll hear a wide range of beliefs about what that passage says. This passage is like that. We're going to be examining some of those ideas this evening. Some of the ideas of that, but I'll just tell you right now what some of the ideas about this verse are. One idea is that this is saying no more than what is said in 1 Timothy 2, and that it's only prohibiting teaching speech. Another is that since the context of this chapter is, and although I'm not sure, I don't really think that that's all that's prohibited by 1 Timothy 2, and we'll get to that in detail later anyway. Another is that since this chapter was dealing with spiritual gifts, it no longer applies today. Another is that these women here are the husbands of these prophets who they would then ask at home, and so it only applies to the women who are married to prophets. Another is that the whole thing was just an issue of interruption. And another is, in a new study Bible that's out, it's a Spiro Zodhiatus or something like that, if you've seen that in any of the bookstores or catalogs. And it's saying his explanation of this is that there was an oracle of Delphi in Corinth that was very famous. And the concern was because this oracle was female and it had to do with paganism, Paul is instructing the Corinthians to not do this so that they won't look like the pagans with the oracle of Delphi. And there's just a lot of different approaches to this text. And so and we'll be looking at the various different approaches tonight. And then of course the other is that the passage means that women are to keep silence in the churches, that they're not permitted to speak, etc. And it just simply means there what it says. We'll be looking at these various things tonight, but that's why somewhat we're going to be looking closely at what these words mean. Now, here's what this word silence means. First instance is in Mark chapter 14, verse 61. In verse 60, it said, the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus and saying, answerest thou nothing? What is it that these witness against thee? And in verse 61, it said, he held his peace and answered nothing. Now that held his peace or kept their peace is a common translation for this word sigeo. Remember, one of the meanings of this word is to stop speaking or become silent. So here Jesus sigeoed and said nothing at that particular point. Next example, Luke chapter 9, verse 36. They're up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and this is after Peter says, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. While he said these things, there came a cloud, this is verse 34, overshadowed them, and they feared as they entered into the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my Son, my chosen, hear ye him. And when the voice came, Jesus was found alone, and they held their peace. And that's the word for sigio. And told no man in those days of any of the things that they had seen. Next example, Luke chapter 20, verse 26. And a lot of these from the Gospels are in the sense of stop speaking, become silent, often translated, hold their peace. Luke 20, verse 26. After the Pharisees have said, should we pay taxes or not? And Jesus said, show me the coin, whose image is on it? And they said, well, Caesar's. And Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now look at verse 26. They were not able to take hold of the saying before the people. They marveled at his answer and sigeo, held their peace. Acts chapter 12, verse 17. Peter has been imprisoned, so was James. James has been killed, And when Herod saw that that pleased the Jews, now he seized Peter. He puts Peter in prison, but the angel released him that night. And when he got out, he went to the house of the mother of John Mark, where a number of disciples were gathered together to pray. And he's knocking on the door, and Rhoda goes down, and it says it's Peter, and she says it's Peter, and they say, well, it's his ghost, and they let him in. And then when he comes in, they saw him and were amazed. And in verse 17, he beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, to sigeo, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him forth out of prison. Next example, Acts chapter 15, verse 12, the discussion in Jerusalem about circumcision. And Peter has just spoken, and he finishes up saying, but we believe we shall be, this is verse 11, we believe we shall be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus in like manner as they. Now verse 12, and all the multitude kept silence and hearkened unto Barnabas and Paul, rehearsing the signs and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles through them. That's the same word here. And then verse 13, and after they held their peace, again, after they kept silence, then James answered and said. And then Romans chapter 16, verse 25. Here it's in the sense of keeping something secret. Romans 16 through 25, verse 25. Now to him that is able to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery which has been kept in silence through times eternal, but now is manifested by the scriptures of the prophets according to the commandment of God, and is made known unto all nations unto obedience of faith. So God's plan, which had been kept in silence before and is now made known. And then the other three examples of this word are all in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. Let's turn there. 1 Corinthians 14, the first is for the tongue speaker. Verse 26. What is it then, brethren, when you come together, each has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Let all things be done unto edifying. If any man speaks in a tongue, let it be by two or at the most three, and that in turn, and let one interpret. Now here's our first example of it. Verse 28. But if there's no interpreter, let him, the tongue speaker, if there's no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Now here's the next example. Verse 29. And let the prophets speak by two or three, and let the others discern. But if a revelation be made known to another sitting by, let the first keep silence. Same word again. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be exhorted, and the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. In the last instance, as in all the churches of saints, let the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak. But let them be in subjection, as also saith the law. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. So when we look at how that word is used, it's used repeatedly of whether by argument, somebody being silenced, or somebody being quiet to listen to somebody else speak, or somebody not knowing what to say or refusing to answer. Someone held their peace and didn't say anything. Or the mystery which before had been silent and is now made known. Or in 1 Corinthians 14, tongue speaker, if there's not a interpreter, keep silence. Prophet, if another receives a revelation, keep silent. Women in the church, keep silent. That's how this word is used. Now let's look at the word for, found over here in 1 Timothy 2. Quietness. Let a woman learn in quietness. This passage, this is not used as many times as the other, but look at the first time that it's used, and we'll see that this is a pretty emphatic silence. Acts chapter 22, verse 2. Paul has just come back from the third missionary journey. He's gone to Jerusalem. James has advised him that he's been misrepresented. And while James says, we know that Gentiles don't need to keep the law, but Jews here have been told that you have been telling Jews not to keep the law, Jews not to circumcise their children. And that's not what Paul had been saying. He'd had Timothy circumcised because he was a Jew. And he said, so that they'll understand this, why don't you go to the temple with these fellows and go through these rituals with them so everybody will see that this isn't true. So Paul does that. But in the whole process of being there during this time and over these days, someone thought that he took a Gentile into the temple, which was punishable by death. There were signs up that said, if a Gentile crosses this line, you're responsible for your own death. Well, they thought that Paul had taken a Gentile in there. And they grabbed him, and they're, I guess, about ready to rip him apart. And the soldiers come, and they take him, and they start up the stairway over here at the Tower of Antonia. And as they're going up the stairway, Paul says, let me say something to them. And in all the confusion, the fellow had mistaken Paul for some Egyptian criminal. He said, you're not the Egyptian? And he said, no, I'm a Hebrew. I'm Saul from Tarsus. Let me speak to the people. And so up here on the stairway, he lets Paul speak. Now watch this. This is interesting. In verse 38 of Acts 21, it says, aren't you then the Egyptian? And in verse 39, Paul said, no, I'm a Jew of Saul of Tarsus. And in verse 40, when he gave him leave, Paul, standing on the chairs, beckoned with the hand to the people. Now look at verse 40 very closely. He beckoned to the hand with the people, and when there was made a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. Now, that first word, the word we're about to look at here in Timothy, is hesukia. And it's about to show up, but this isn't it. Where it says he beckoned with his hand and there was a great silence, it's the noun of this word. It's not the verb. The verb is in 1 Corinthians 14, and we looked at the times that the verb is used. But twice in Scripture, the noun of this word was used. Once in Revelation 8, you remember that verse that said there was a silence in heaven for half an hour? That's the noun of this word. And the other time is right here, when it says there was a great silence. Now, read the next verse. Brethren and fathers, hear ye the defense which now I make to you. In verse 2 of chapter 22, when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they were the more quiet. And that is this word, hesukia. Now, you might think, and one time I thought, well, that means that this word's a stronger word than that word. Well, no. The thing that makes it stronger is what? That little word more on the front. Then they got more quiet. This word, as we're about to find out, is not really a stronger word than this word. What makes it stronger there is the more on the front. But this passage illustrates that this word can extend to silence, but not always. This is a broader word like our English word, quiet. Because let me show you another place where this is used in a very different way. Look at 2 Thessalonians 3:12. Do you remember the problem in Thessalonica? Most of the people were great, but you had a few people that were what? They just wouldn't work. They were busy getting their nose in other people's business. They were going around gossiping and stuff. They weren't working. They were eating other people's food. And Paul, when he was there, he told them not to do that. He told them to get a job. When he wrote back to them in 1 Thessalonians, he said, as I told you before, get a job and eat your own food. By 2 Thessalonians, he's about to the end of his rope with them, and he said to the rest of them, look, you're just going to have to withdraw from these people that won't work and get their own food and behave themselves. And he says here in verse 10 of chapter 3, 2 Thessalonians 10, for even when we were with you, this we commanded you, if any will not work, neither let him eat. For we hear of some that walk among you disorderly, that work not at all, but are busybodies. Now look at verse 12. Now them that are such we command and exhort in the name of the Lord Jesus, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. Now what does that mean? Does that mean get a job where you don't speak? You can get a job where you're silent. No, that means pipe down and mind your own business, and in quietness do this. The other places where this word is used, hesukia, is in 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12. In 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12 is where it says that the women are to learn in quietness with all subjection. I permit not a woman to teach, but to be in quietness. Now, what have we just seen about this word? It can mean quiet. Like when everybody got really quiet to listen to Paul, and then when they heard him speak in Hebrew, they got even more quiet. It can mean that kind of quiet. But it can also mean what? It can also just mean the demeanor of the person who may be speaking, who may be talking, but live a quiet life. So which is it in 1 Timothy 2? From 1 Timothy 2, we wouldn't necessarily be able to nail it down, because the word can be used this way and it can be used that way. Is it the Acts 22 end of the word? Or is it the 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians end of the word? Let me show you a couple of other places where it's used more in the 2 Thessalonians idea. We're going to have to move to the noun now because we've already looked at all the times for the verb. But look at the noun use of it in this same chapter. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. I exhort, therefore, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, thanksgivings be made for all men, for kings that are all in high places, and all that are in high places, that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life. That is the noun of which this other word, or the adjective, of which this other, it's another word, one, in this verse it's hesukia. In the verse I'm reading you now, it's hesukias. It's a related form of the word. And it says a quiet life. Well, clearly that has to do with demeanor, not silence. One more example of that, 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, verse 1. Also a passage about women and subjection. In like manner, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that even if any obey not the word, they may without the word be gained by the behavior of their wives, beholding your chaste behavior coupled with fear. Whose adorning let it not be the outward adorning of the braiding of hair, wearing of jewels, or of gold, or putting on of apparel. Very similar, you'll notice, to what it said in 1 Timothy right before the instruction there. But let it be the hidden man of the heart, of the incorruptible apparel of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And this quiet is, again, it's not hesukia that we have here, but it's the related word, hesukias. And it tells wives to have a quiet spirit, and then look at the example. For after this manner aforetime, holy women also, who hoped in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Now here it refers to, of course, Sarah speaking to her husband is an example of her being what? Meek and quiet. So clearly, hesukia has a broad range of meaning, like our English word quiet. That's why I think quiet is a real good translation for this, because our English word quiet can mean, a quiet type person, a quiet spirit, or it can mean be quiet. And that's exactly the same range that we see here. That's why, for instance, while sigio is more emphatic and is defined by Ark and Gingrich as say nothing, keep silent, and stop speaking, become silent, or keep secret, conceal, when we look up hesukia, we find here as, okay, it can mean silence, or it can mean quietness. So which term is more emphatic? The one in 1 Corinthians 14. Which has more latitude? This one here. I believe that the one in 1 Timothy 2 should be understood more on the Acts 22 end of the scale because of the somewhat parallel passage in 1 Corinthians 14. But if it weren't for this passage, if I look at this word hesukia and it says, in quietness, not teaching, it would be a little bit of an open-ended question. It would clearly prohibit what? Teaching, and clearly instruct quietness, but instructing it with a word that has some latitude. One more point on that, and then we'll touch on another word, and then we'll finish up for this morning. Look back at 1 Corinthians 14. Not only does 1 Corinthians 14 use a more emphatic word, and by the way, there's various places in Scripture where we find this, where two texts refer to the same thing, and one will give more detail than the other one. For instance, you've got two descriptions of the qualifications of elders in Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. One says, apt to teach. Well, that's kind of general. The other says, able to exhort in sound doctrine and convict the gainsayer, which is more specific. This one's more specific. Now, we don't say then, well, all that really means is just able. The more specific one we use to help explain the distance here. One says that the children have to be faithful. The other doesn't mention that the children have to be faithful. So various places in Scripture, one passage may state something in somewhat general terms, and another passage may state it more emphatically. Now, the other thing, if we look at 1 Corinthians 14, Paul in this text, whatever it means, whether it's talking about prophets' wives, whether it's talking about don't be like the oracle of Delphi, or whether it's talking about all women in all the churches, or whatever, which we'll look at tonight, Paul pretty much explains what he means here by silence, doesn't he? Let's read the text. As in all churches of saints, let the women keep silence in the churches, for it's not permitted unto them to speak. Even if we hadn't looked up that word silence, what does this statement here do for us? That lets us know it's not just talking about demeanor. That means don't speak. But let them be in subjection, as also saith the law. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. Why? For it's shameful for a woman to speak in the church. So he's gone into detail here that this silence is one that talks about not speaking, and it is not only ruling out teaching speech, but even asking speech, learning speech. Now, what about this phrase here, in the church? Let the women keep silence in the church. What does church mean? Well, we know what church means. Church means group of people. It's ecclesia, which comes from called and out. It's used both secularly and religiously in the Bible to refer to a group of people. In Acts 19, it's used more than once of a group of people, not religiously. Other times it's used religiously of a group of people. Church does not mean in this text, in this building. And that's, I think, one thing that gives people a problem. They think, okay, if it says women keep not speak in the church, they didn't have a building. Where did they meet? We studied recently in another sermon about the Church of Corinth. They met at the house of Gaius at this time. And so the church is meeting at the house of Gaius. When he says, keep silence in the church, he doesn't mean in the church building, and he doesn't mean in the house of Gaius, because all sorts of things went on in the house of Gaius. What does he mean? He means in the assembly. The word church is used several ways in the New Testament. It's used universally. Matthew 16:18, Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. That's in the universal sense. It's used locally. Romans 16:16, the churches of Christ salute you. This church, that church, another church. Revelation 2 and 3, the 7 churches of Asia, the churches of Galatia, etc. And it's also used in Corinthians in 2 different chapters of the local church assembled. Those 2 times are these, and we'll stop with this point. 1 Corinthians 11. When you come together in the church, it's not possible for you to take the Lord's Supper. How did he use the word church there? Not in the universal sense, and also not just in the local sense. Because when Paul went about laying waste the church, for example, that wasn't just when people were assembled. When he attacked Christians, he was attacking what? The church. You are a member of the church universal if you belong to Christ. If you're a member of this congregation, you are a member of this local church. When? Just when we're sitting here? No. On Monday you're a member of this, you're in the church. On Tuesday you're in the church, in the sense of the local church. But on Monday and Tuesday, when you're at work or whatever, are you in the assembly? No. And that's the sense of church in both 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14. In 1 Corinthians 11, it says, when you come together in the church, it's not possible to take the Lord's Supper because of the way you're doing it. And 1 Corinthians 14 says in verse 23, if the whole church be gathered together in one place. This is one place where I prefer the King James over the American Standard Version, because there's a Greek phrase in there that the American Standard just skips. It says, if the whole church be assembled together. The King James reflects the fact that in the Greek, there's yet another emphasis of a togetherness. It's a phrase, epitau auto. Translated literally, it would be upon the it. But it's kind of an idiom for getting together. I'll tell you another place where it's used. Remember in 1 Corinthians 7, where it talks about husbands and wives, don't be apart from each other, too long, and come back together? Right there, this epitau auto shows up again, coming back together upon the it. And in verse 23, when Paul's talking about the church coming together, there are three phrases there. And the emphasis is really upon assembly. Look at it. From the King James, he says, if therefore the whole church, and of course church means assembly, even if it means the assembled people of God in the world, assembled before God, not assembled in one location, or here, as in 1 Corinthians 11, a local church assembled together. So he uses the word church, and then what does he put in front of it? The whole church be assembled together, which makes it even more emphatic. And then the King James reflects the fact that there's even another phrase, in one place. So what you have then, by the end, you've got in verse 23, if therefore, not just the church be assembled, if the whole church be assembled together in one place. This is talking about the assembly. This is not talking about groups of Christians together other than the whole church assembled together in one place. We are not, when we're divided up in classes, is that the whole church assembled together in one place? No, it's not. That's why we don't take the Lord's Supper that way. If we said, Scott was going to go overtime this morning, and so let's have the Lord's Supper during the classes, somebody would say, no, 1 Corinthians 11 talks about we're supposed to do that in the assembly. That's exactly right. That's not the assembly. This is the assembly. All right, I hope that we haven't answered much about these texts other than seeing what these words mean. And that will save us some time tonight, because if I had tried to go through what all these words mean tonight, then y'all would have shot me. So, appreciate your attention, and we'll take a look at what that text means this evening. Thank you very much. If anyone's subject to the invitation, won't you come as we stand and sing?